自分がライオンになった夢。楽しみでなく生き残るためライオンは殺す。どんなライオンも縄張りがあって生き残る。欲望を有刺鉄線が遮る。私たち2頭のライオンは目を開けセックスをする。
Well, we've just seen the movie, and maybe my first question, just for the beginning, would be how it was made, how it was created. So if you can give us some, like a bit like introduction, maybe to how it happened.
Yeah, hello everyone. I just wanted to say by introduction, I want to acknowledge this difficult time we're going through, and each in our own place, and thank the Fotograf Festival and especially Teresa Rudolph and the team for working so hard to make this possible. I also want to thank all of you for watching the film, and I really wish I could be there with you so much. You don't know. Okay, so the film started back in a whole other parallel universe when I was invited to Tokyo Art and Space for a residency. I was working, I had just shot a documentary-based film, Girls Museum, in Leipzig, Germany, which I'm premiering in 2 weeks at Doc Leipzig. And just so you know, there will be an online component of the festival. So if you're curious, please go to Doc Leipzig and watch the film. It's about girls and museums, just like the title said. Anyway, going back to Tokyo was wonderful. I had made a film called 37 Stories About Leaving Home, about mothers, daughters, and grandmothers in Tokyo, also interview-based. And I wanted to revisit this question of the position of women globally, but especially in Tokyo. So the way I started, knowing that I couldn't possibly make a documentary, the residency was only 6 weeks, I started researching how the situation had changed, interviewing women, but in a very informal way in bars, cafes, restaurants, going out to dinner with people I knew, and in a way related to the American woman, the American researcher that's in the film. So this was one component of starting the project. The next component was arriving in the neighborhood where the residency was, Tatekawa. And I was incredibly disappointed by the neighborhood at first. It was neither new or old. It was semi-small industry. It wasn't seductive at all in any of those typical Tokyo or Japan ways. I found it kind of grim and silent, but then the longer I stayed there, the more seduced I became of the place. And so that was another big start to the film, the discovery of this neighborhood.
Okay, so maybe also a little bit, because we saw some sort of tasting, how do you work usually, but I'm not sure if people here actually saw other movies by you. You said they will have a chance to do so during Doc Leipzig, then later online. But maybe if you can somehow introduce really your working process, how do you deal with images, text, composition, kind of?
Often, like with this film, I start with research, and then I put all the research aside and I kind of forget about it. Of course, I don't unconsciously forget about it, but it's not front in my mind, like I have a theory or something I want to espouse. And often with my films, it starts with a feeling. The feeling of this place that is so easy to overlook. The summer that was the hottest summer on record in Tokyo, and Tokyo gets really hot, so this was really something. Every time I left my apartment, it was like a wall of moisture, of humidity that would hit me, and the sun that was so sharp, and especially like my more collage films, I tend to start just with a feeling, starting to film, starting to write down small fragments of language. I knew very much that I wanted to combine the stories of these interviews or these meetings with these women that were surprisingly filled with anger. I had really expected them to tell me, oh, Shelly, things are so much better than the 90s for women. We have so many more opportunities, we're working. And instead, so many of the women were really frustrated, really angry. And then the place, and as I found out, this place had been totally firebombed by the United States, basically napalm out of existence in this one night, as is told in the film, of bombing where 100,000 people were killed in one night in Tokyo. And so this plus also, and this maybe is related to the science fiction part of the, or the quote unquote science fiction part of the film, you know, so dealing with the neighborhood's history, Fukushima, which is always an echo still in Japan and in Tokyo, and then the summer of catastrophes in Japan, but not only, of the extreme heat, people dying from the heat, flooding in Kansai. And so all of this just got mixed up into my head, and also this deadline of knowing that I would have to shoot a film in 6 weeks if I was going to make a film. So sort of running around all day, filming, writing, editing all at the same time. Unlike a typical film process, which would be writing a treatment, trying to raise some money, you know, maybe writing a script, you know, and then finally shooting. I just don't work that way. Yeah.
So actually we can see it's, especially in this movie, it's a bit like partly biographical, so there is some aspects like of your life or what you're doing that actually goes into the movie partly.
Of course, every film I've ever made is a self-portrait, as far-flung as that could be. On the other hand, and even, for example, when my students are making like self-portraits of themselves, you know, documentaries about themselves, I always say, you are always dealing with a character. You're not really dealing with yourself. It's a distanced self. With this film, there were aspects of my experience and the women that I interviewed, but is this character me? She's much younger than me. She's an academic. She's married, possibly in the future going through a bad divorce, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there are related aspects, and some of which, you know, I know and the viewer will never know, others of which really have nothing to do with me. And I really love that. I mean, that's the magic of fiction, that you could really make things up, really make things up, and nobody is going to hold you to them. Yeah, about me, yes and no. I'm American, right? I'm American, and of course, that's a huge aspect of the film, the position of being an American, and yet I'm writing from the point of view of a Japanese woman.
Even though I have a lot of questions still, I would like to ask maybe if someone here has a question now. It can be even posed in Czech. I can try to translate it. Yes?
Já bych se zeptala vlastně, a jak sama autorka to teda analyzuje, že vlastně to velký chaos, problémy, ako to, že vlastně jako celá ta problematizácia vlastně skončila v nějaké love story. Jako já mám pocit, že vlastně ona jako vyústila do nějaké love story. Ako to, že vlastně jako po výsledku tu mám jako love story.
Okay, so So obviously there is a lot of topics and themes and problems, I mean, on the global scale that you actually try to put into the movie. But in the end, it seems like it all ends up as a sort of love story. So, or yeah, it's covered like a love story. So why is that?
I mean, I would say that that's an umbrella story. Certainly the story that starts out as maybe a lust story and then edges closer to a love story. And this was very important to me. Also, before my personal experience in Tokyo that summer, alone, and yet with the sensuality of this constant moisture. It also gives a kind of pretext of these two women coming together and being able to fight or dialogue. I wouldn't say that it ends up completely as a love story in that the last story, the last science fiction story, is really a story of these women coming together. I mean, if you're going to put it under the umbrella of a love story, then put it under the umbrella of save the world story, right? That there's this hope that through these women coming together, that something else is possible.
Okay, then maybe I would go, because you mentioned it several times, back to the aspects of language, maybe. Because now on the festival, Fotograf Festival, there is one of your older movies, or few of your older movies. One of them is about some sort of portrait of Chinatown. Five questions, 9 answers about Chinatown. And again, there is something about language and about writing in Chinese, and this sort of like a graphical aspect of language, as well as the problematics of translation and possibility of translating ideas. So is this like an important theme for you? I mean, yeah, the topic that not everything can be translated, or that the word is somehow created through the language, let's say. So does it play a role?
Absolutely. If you think of 5 lessons and 9 questions about Chinatown, there's a film that's in 2 different two dialects, Cantonese and Mandarin, and then English. And there's this kind of understanding, misunderstanding between all 3. And the other interesting thing about the film is that quite possibly only Chinese people know that there's Cantonese and Mandarin. So depending on your position watching the film, you have a different understanding of it. I would say that continues very much through my film Touch, which is a fictional essay film about from the point of view of a Chinese man who speaks Mandarin, who grew up in New York City, Chinatown, mostly Cantonese speaking, and in an American, English speaking country. And this question of translation and the position that you're in based on the language you speak is very forward, as in this film, where one of the main characters, the narrator, actually is a translator and constantly having to navigate explaining. And I have to say that the translation of this film, because it was written in English, although I had a Japanese assistant, was very, very difficult. It's a very difficult translation, English, Japanese, back and forth. And finally, one of the things I decided to go for was the rhythm of the language. The person who translated it, Ryo Nimoto, is really a writer. Is really a poet, and this was very important, the cadence of the language. So language for me is never transparent. It's always problematized, but it's also very rich. And through this, to get back to the love story, it was possible to navigate this love story between this Japanese woman and this American woman who was obviously much more clueless than the Japanese woman on this territory.
maybe, again, some questions from the audience. There.
What is the most important part you take from a Japanese approach to story making, and why do Japanese stories end badly?
So maybe I will repeat it, right? Or have you?
No, you need to repeat
Yeah.
it. It's echoing.
So what is the most important part you have taken from a Japanese storytelling? And yeah, that's it? Or yeah.
And why do all Japanese stories end badly?
Yeah, and why do all Japanese stories end badly?
Oh, okay. Well, this is a really interesting question. And this actually goes back to my film. I do recommend you seeing 37 Stories About Leaving Home, which is so much about Japanese storytelling. Both there's a fairy tale that runs through it, but also it's all about the stories that these women tell. With this, I would say first, not all Japanese stories end badly. The stories that the protagonist, the narrator, tells, not all of them end badly. For example, the story about the sex through the pores, you could say that that was a kind of happy story. And then the end story is possibly, if not a happy ending, it's a hopeful ending. But I think that what the American woman was remarking on is that all of the stories that the Japanese narrator was telling ended badly. Yeah, so it was within the story. The broader question of Japanese storytelling, it's interesting because these 7 stories, I read an enormous amount of traditional stories. So they're somehow in my head, and also the stories that the women were telling me who I interviewed. But I didn't think about that directly. I have to say that I didn't think, oh, the narrator is telling stories. I just thought, what stories would this character come up with? I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, yeah, we have a little bit problems with signal, but I guess it was okay. Yeah, good. No, I think we don't know on which side it is, but it was understandable. Anyway, maybe this is maybe a bit silly question I have, but anyway, I need to ask that. It's in many of your movies, already since like 80s, the end of 80s, there is usually a lot of animals. So I guess it's a quite important thing for you. And as well, in this movie, there are a lot of birds and fish. So yeah, why is it important that much, or how does it enrich the story?
I'm trying to think of the films that you're thinking about from the 80s. But I'll start actually with a film that really centers around animals, which would be Frog, Spider, Hand, Horse, House, which is really about animals and children. And there I made a very conscious decision. I think about that as the first of a trilogy of films having to do with, if not the end of the world, this very precarious situation we're in terms of the environment. And I started being interested, but also politically wanting to turn the camera away from humans and more towards more beleaguered creatures, children and animals that we're sort of ruining the world for. And with Frog, Spider, Hand, Horse, House, it was very tender look at them. With A Strange New Beauty, it was more crash and burn, as if humans occupy the soundtrack, but you never see a human being, as if the film was made after humans were all destroyed. And all that was left were kind of memories or stories, but then still you have beautiful landscaping and houses and birds and a dog. And with this film, I would say mostly it had to do with the place. That the place was not, unlike a lot of Tokyo, was very sparsely inhabited by people. So that when I would turn my camera, you know, maybe you see someone far off walking, but mostly it was inhabited by the beings on the river. You know, fish, birds, crabs, whatever passed by. And I got more and more interested in this also, maybe for that same reason that whenever I tried to put a person into the film, more in close-up, the film just denied their presence. It just said, no, you can't do this. And so then what was left, like it was okay, the film was okay with putting posters up of people's faces, this and that, you know, billboards, that was okay. But for whatever reason, yeah, putting like neighbors in or whatever, it just didn't seem to work out except for the girl at the very end. Also, probably, as you know, people really don't like to be filmed necessarily on the street anymore, which I think is a terrible thing. And I hope it changes. But there too, I wanted to be true to the neighborhood. I didn't want to bother anyone. And anyway, the film didn't seem to want people. It seemed to want this other life, which was the surprise of the film for me and the place. You know, how do you capture this place that seems dead, but is actually full of this life that gets compressed into this river? You know, everything, all the life of the neighborhood went to the river because that was the tiny bandwidth that where these creatures could survive. Yeah.
So maybe it brings another question, which would be how we already talked about it a little bit, or you talked about it a little bit, but for me, it's always a question, how much or what is first, a classical question, the image or the idea? You partly answered that you are quite much influenced by what is happening around, but also it's something that is quite persistent in your movies. So for example, when when the narrator talks about a tooth or horn, there was a horn. When there is some mentioning, some metaphor of a tree, then there is a tree. So it feels like this, the language and the language of images goes somehow unconsciously or subconsciously together. So maybe it's just, am I like understanding this correctly? That's the way how to narrate it.
Yeah, I mean, I start with a feeling and a place with this film, and also a kind of desire to make a story. And then because of the way I work, because nothing is being privileged, you could weave things, right? That every morning I would go at 7 a.m., sometimes earlier, to McDonald's for coffee. It was the first place that was open in the neighborhood. And I would just sit there with index cards, writing the story and looking at the world. Sometimes before that, I would film the river if the light was really nice or something happened, you know, and then I would go back to the residency and I would, you know, sometimes I would film more, sometimes I would write more, sometimes I would take the camera out for a walk. And when you work that way, things get woven in ways that allow for a kind of subconscious, that allow for something happens that day and immediately it could enter into the film. And I really love working that way. It's a way that it's really good to work if you have a deadline, because it could be endless. This could just go on forever. And so with this, I had a deadline for an open studio. I needed to cut together a scene or two for the open studio. So I worked finally at the end like a maniac, bringing enough of the story together so that it could be recognizable. And then I brought all the footage back home. At that point, the filming was sadly over, But then I sort of rushed as much as I could to recapture the feeling I had. I knew I couldn't start working on the Leipzig film because this film was much more fragile. You know, the Leipzig film, I had the interviews. It was like, you know, a solid amount of kind of information. And so this film I prioritized so that I remembered what my feelings were. I remembered this place. And yeah, and then I had, and it was also a more seductive project to work on, you know. So I was able to complete it, and then I went back to Girls Museum. Yeah. Yeah, I love working this way. I feel very privileged to be able to work this way because my films cost very little money to make. And I don't have a producer insisting on things. I don't have a timeline until I commit to a deadline, which is usually the first screening.
Okay, so yeah.
What was the approach to the montage of the film? Because as it is not anthropocentric, it could be very easily to fall into some kind of like a mannerism with montage, but it's very slowly graduating in something. So if there are some conflicts about that or something.
Okay, I'll repeat it. What was your approach to the montage? Because as you said, you had no guidelines or rules. So maybe it could end up into some sort of mannerism, but it did not, according to the audience. So yeah, so maybe how did you manage, or what is the approach to the montage?
It's a hard question to answer. It's a great question, but I've been making films for so long, and so it's sort of like the air I breathe, and each film calls for a different kind of montage, a different kind of pacing, but it's something that I discover by doing. I mean, I knew that I wanted to start, I mean, maybe that's the approach. I knew I wanted to start with this view from my apartment. There's a balcony, actually it's a walkway, to across the canal to these buildings where it's very hard to figure out the space. It's really interesting space. There are these buildings, and I knew I wanted to start there. I knew I wanted to articulate the space without really explaining it. And I knew that it would start a kind of, the way I see it, slowly. You know, this was a section that I wrote for the open studio. And I just thought in terms of the dialogue, just start with why they met. You know, it's a very kind of obvious introduction. And then as the film changes, as you know, the stories called for maybe a different kind of montage, slightly, you know, different places. I mean, you have the turtles take a huge center stage in it, you know, so by that time in the film, I thought I could allow for that kind of emotionality or that kind of projection. You know, in the scene where, you know, the American comes back after being beaten up. Okay, so that's another way of looking at it. And then for me, just intuitively, I knew at the end of the film, that last story called for a different kind of editing, you know, where, okay, we get to have fun, you know, like, let's do single frames, let's do this, let's do that. I would never have started the film that way. But I didn't think it out. I just thought, okay, here we are at the end. Let's see if I can get away with this. I mean, that's a question I ask myself a lot when I'm editing, not so much when I'm shooting. When I'm editing, can I get away with that? Will it hold? When I'm shooting, it's especially a film like this, it's lower stakes because I could try it and then I don't use it. You know, I just don't use it. But with editing, it's sort of like, how far can I go, but still manage, you know, still have it work or have it work better having gone a little further.
So I guess, yeah, we can afford last question and last answer. So go ahead.
Shelly Silver říkala, že lidi mají problém s tím být filmováním. A tak to třeba jako?
Okay, so you said that people nowadays have a problem or are not allowing being filmed on streets. Actually, just that's one of Shelly's movie, which is called What I'm Looking For, which actually kind of deals with this topic. But anyway, it's true that it's not so often in your movies, and you mentioned this. So how did you mean it? Did you mean it just in Japan or in general?
I would say it's really country to country. And also because I've been filming for a very, very long time, I've seen the change. And of course, it depends on what relationship you have to people. You know, if you're doing a street interview, people could be thrilled to be in front of the camera. If I ask someone on a Tokyo street, can you take my picture, and you hand them the camera, and then you say, okay, now can I take your picture? Chances are they'll be very happy with that exchange. I did another film called Suicide, which is all about this, and in a much more extreme way, this question of street filming. I would never get away with doing it now. You know, this was from 2003. For me, a lot of my films actually, except recently, deal with filming people on the street. I think it's a breakdown of social fabric that we can no longer do this. And I think it's also a projection because we have no control of being filmed by corporations. We have no control of being filmed by the government, by the police. But we do feel like we have control over being filmed by each other. And I find this really sad because, as I say in the film Touch, you know, filming, looking at people, especially in the neighborhood where you live and otherwise, could be a very wonderful thing. If you think of the history of street photography and all of the images, stories, people that we would just never know about without this filming, without this photography, it would be devastating, right? We wouldn't know what life was like then. So it's something that I've thought a lot about, but in Tokyo this summer, I felt that this was a personal story, a story between these two women, that it didn't make sense to film people or try to figure out a way to be comfortable filming people. It also wasn't from the point of view of a tourist or of a gaijin, of a foreigner. I mean, that was a question that you asked, Teresa, about the still, you know, the camera on a tripod. And this was in a way to not locate it from a point of view, you know, not from the protagonist's point of view, not from the American's point of view. It's from this kind of tripod point of view in a way. And me filming would have changed, would have affected the images I was getting of people. I would say that the image, the girl at the end, very much was influenced by me being behind the camera and this kind of wonderful interaction with this girl. But again, by then, the rule could be broken and the meaning of it within the story was completely other than, oh, look, there's an American with a big camera, you know, like, hi, you know, it was like a sharing of a moment, this magical, fragile moment in the rain, yeah. But I very much, I think it's so important for us to film each other. And this is something that came up very much this summer. I was filming the demonstrations and the occupation at City Hall and the police. And there, it is this moment where filming is also, it's a form of documentation sharing, and it's also a form of protection, I have to say, quite frankly, because different things happen when there's not a camera around, as we've found out recently.
Okay, so yeah, I think if there is something you want to add maybe to the movie we haven't mentioned, or you have feeling that it's still we have like 5 minutes, so maybe, I don't know.
I do have a question, and
Yeah.
I don't know if the person who asked about the love story is still there, but it seemed like it was a disappointment that it was absorbed into a love story. I guess I'm curious to hear more about that.
So, yeah, please.
Ne, jako nebylo to rozhodně zklamání, jako pro mě, že jako se ten umel vlastně těch emocí jako zúžil do té love story, ale jako je to jeden ze způsobů, jako vlastně můžeme zrozumiteľne jako zrozumiteľne zapojiť do seba vlastne nejaké ako nesúvislé podnety a vlastne prejsť naozaj nejakým druhom konfliktu a vlastne nejakého možného vyriešenia. Takže pre mňa to prišlo ako veľmi, veľmi pochopiteľné.
Yeah. So it was not a disappointment actually, but the thing is that, for example, this sort of so the narration through a love story or any relationship makes sense to us. So obviously it is something that could be like a glue to a story. So then it was not disappointment, but it was one way how to grasp the movie easily and understand it. So that's why, yeah.
How to grasp the conflicting emotions.
Yeah, how to grasp the conflicting emotions in the movie. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that it like something is at stake that you can feel emotionally through hopefully through this relationship. It's a film that's really almost completely devoid of people, which is a kind of risk in terms of people being able to identify. Also a film that's in a foreign language for most people. And so I didn't make it a love story for those reasons. As I said, I had a very personal reason for making it a love story, but also this kind of conflict between the presumptuous American woman and the Japanese woman, of the American woman kind of feeling that she understands possibly Japanese women more than the Japanese woman, or this conflict, this anger, this depth of the anger of the Japanese woman towards the United States for this wiping out of her family. And so all of those things can be articulated without a relationship, but they take on bigger stakes, I think, with a relationship where you actually have a desire for the other person, even if the desire at the beginning is just sexual. You know, this approaching and then being pushed back and approaching. So I'm not I mean, I've worked on a bunch of narratives, but it's not something that I do all the time. But again, this way that I work makes it possible to develop the character and the story over time. You know, I just had a little bit of sense. These two women come together, and you know, how do they navigate that relationship? Although probably in the back of my head, I wanted it to have somewhat of a happy ending, although it's implied that the American woman goes back to the United States and her, you know, relationship there.
Okay, so I think it will be the end. So thank you very much for joining us.